Welcome back. Now, war and conflict gravely increases the chances of children being exploited. One of the many ways this is done is by taking child soldiers into military ranks. Now, the world largely has come to an agreement regarding how there needs to be an end to recruitment of child soldiers. But has that understanding, in fact, changed the threat children face during times of conflict? That's our discussion today. Joining us to explore this is Mr. Fadel Abdul Ghany, Chairman and Founder of the Syrian Network for Human Rights. He joins us from Istanbul. Also joining us is Ms. Julia Toma, spokeswoman of UNICEF, she is the Regional Chief of Communications at UNICEF Middle East and North Africa. She joins us from Amman. And Mr. Patrick Oid, who's our correspondent, joining us from South Sudan. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to the show. Ms. Toma, I'd like to begin with you. Now, children continue to be disproportionately affected by armed conflict in many parts of the world. But when we talk about child soldiers, how is the impact of this different than a child who is living through conflict?
Yeah, so I think, thank you first of all for dedicating the time for this. And I think given the high number of conflicts in this region, we have seen an increase, a significant increase in the number of children who are fighting. That is the case in places like Syria, but also in places like Sudan and Yemen, and to a lesser extent in Iraq.
Right, and you're saying numbers continue to increase. I also talked about how an agreement has been made between governments, how governments have tried to pledge that they will reduce these numbers. Yet we're seeing these numbers continuously increase. Why do you think that is?
Because of the conflicts. I mean, the armed conflicts in the places I mentioned have meant that more families, in fact, have become poorer. And one of the reasons why families push their children to be recruited into the fighting is the socioeconomic situation. In many cases, families cannot make ends meet in places like Yemen, like Syria, like Sudan. And so there is an economic factor to why children are pushed into armed conflict.
Right. Of course, it's a very complex sort of a situation, one that has many factors leading to the end result. I'd like to talk to Mr. Oid about South Sudan. As Ms. Toma mentioned, that we are seeing numbers expand within Sudan. UNICEF also reported that at least 19,000 child soldiers still remain to be within Sudan. What do you think are factors unique to this region that are contributing to military ranks continuously absorbing child soldiers?
Yeah, there are many factors. You know, if we are talking about child soldiers in Sudan and South Sudan, there are very many factors. It may need me to go a little bit back in time. For example, the 21 years war between the southern region and the northern Sudan was actually, you know, something that took so many years. So many people in the southern region joined the fighting, and children also, some joined voluntarily, some because they lost their parents, they didn't have anybody to take care of them. They went and joined, you know, the military, and they were fighting. That's why there was a name for the child soldiers, which was known as Red Army or Jesh Amer in Arabic in the Sudan here. Now, some of those people have now grown up, they have become adults, they are men and women, but even in the current conflict where, you know, for 5 years South Sudan has been at war with itself, beginning from 2013, so many children have also been pushed to join the armed groups. Some joined voluntarily because they lost their parents, they didn't have anyone to take care of them, they saw their parents being killed, and they joined as a means to, you know, also carry out some form of revenge. Some were abducted. They were not willing to join the armed groups, but they were abducted. At first, they objected to this, but, you know, as time went on, some of them became used to this because they found some kind of freedom. If you wanted something, you could take by force. Yeah. So yes, those are some of the factors that push actually many here to go and join these armed groups. And if I may continue. Now, as the peace agreement was signed in 2018, now there are provisions in the peace agreement. For example, like the soldiers of the opposition are supposed to be kept in some camps known as cantonment sites. Now, opposition and all parties started, recruiting more as people move to the camp, so that the tyranny of number. Somebody wants to say that we have this number of soldiers. They don't care whether they are children, whether they are adults. So they were just recruiting people to make sure that they have the numbers, so that they say, we have a big force, so you need to give us a big portion in the government. So this also, according to UN, United Nations Human Rights Commission in South Sudan, they have reported that this peace process, the fact of people getting cantoned in the sites, have also forced some armed groups to continue to recruit children. Not only that, even at the present moment in Sudan and South Sudan, there are wars going on. There are groups that are not party to the current peace agreement, and they are actually still recruiting people, including children. So it's a big factor in this region,
right.
Yes.
Right. Mr. Umar, going back to you and talking a little more about child soldiers and talking about gender involved in this. Now, of course, it is true that it is not just boys who make up or constitute the number of children who go into these military ranks. Young girls also constitute a large number of these people. Give us a sense of that. Expand on this, the nature of the tasks that are involved when these children join these ranks.
Okay, well, so when it comes to the region I cover, the Middle East and North Africa, it is largely boys. There are some girls, but the numbers are much less. And normally it is adolescents, so ages 14 and above. But the problem is that because of the escalation of violence in places like Syria and like Yemen, we have seen children as young as 7 years old getting recruited to the fighting. And so this is absolutely unacceptable at any age, but let alone at that tiny age. Now, there are huge consequences as well on children who get recruited into the fighting. I mean, the psychological impact that this has on children is huge, and it also has long-term implications on the well-being, on the health of these children, especially because what we have seen in this region is a transformation in roles, in the sense that while in the beginning of these crises, the children were being used in secondary roles as porters, as cooks, as medical assistants, we have seen gradually a change in that role to children taking a much more active role, children carrying weapons, children being trained on using weapons, including in some occasions heavy weapons, and children in extreme cases were used as suicide bombers and as killers.
Right. Now, the number of things that you've mentioned here, the reasons why children are brought into military ranks and what they are expected to do. Mr. Fadel Abdul Ghany, as we have been talking, in Sudan, we're seeing expanding numbers of child soldiers, but this is also the case in Syria. As the conflict becomes more complex, as it continues, of course, the situation intensifies. There are more and more casualties. But we mentioned that many children voluntarily join as child soldiers. What do you feel like in Syria is the situation when we talk about these increasing numbers?
In Syria is more complicated because there is several perpetrators. At the beginning, we are talking about the state, which is Assad regime, and the non-state actor. And those also non-state actor also is a various level. So if we go to the Assad regime, which start hiring the children at the early stage of the conflict, even before there is shortage in his forces, by hiring some local militia, and those militia also carrying a sectarian touch, we noticed that there is a lot of children in between, and that's increased and escalate the conflict itself. If we move to the non-state actor, there is some types of centralization of some actors, like the Kurd forces. This side you can talk about, you can impose sanction, you can pressure them. There is structure. So those, for example, supported by the U.S. Government. So, and we keep actually pressuring that the Kurd forces is still hiring and recruiting children, and also sometimes kidnapping children because they have lack of forces. If we move now toward the extremist group is something totally different. This hiring children since early ages actually, and they start ideologically teaching them. Here, how you can deal with this phenomena is something different than the government and the center body like the Kurd forces, but voluntarily.
Mr. Ghany, you mentioned several points here, but one of the important points that I want to pick up, and I want to refer this to Ms. Touma, is how Mr. Ghany talked about some parties, some will come under the pressure of sanctions, that will come under the pressure of international talk. Now, Ms. Touma, as I mentioned before, we talked about how international organizations, how international partners, how countries have come to the agreement that this is wrong, that they want to stop it. But practically, in violence and conflict, the situation gets so complicated that it is not easy to actually determine what are the laws and legalities. Can there ever be an end to child soldiers until there isn't an end to conflict?
Look, I mean, even wars and conflicts, they have laws. I mean, there is the international humanitarian law, there's international human rights law. They were actually put in place because of conflicts and wars around the world. And so the laws are very clear. Children should not be recruited into the fighting. It's very, very clear. And so this should not happen. Children belong at home where they're safe with their families. Children belong in schools where they can get educated, where they can flourish, where they can prosper to be the good adults that this world desperately needs. And so the rules are really clear, and it is actually a grave violation of children's rights to recruit children into the fighting.
Right. Just before I let you go, I want to talk about the rehabilitation process. Now, UNICEF has worked to recover, to bring back into society many, many child soldiers. What is the process of rehabilitation like?
So it's actually one of the great things that this organization that I work with does, is the rehabilitation of children who have previously fought and reintegration into societies, like you said. And there is a very long and detailed process on how this can be done. The bottom line is that it can be done. So there is hope for children who are forced and who get exploited to fight into these wars. And so there is the psychosocial or psychological support that is given to the child so that he or she can get out of the initial shock and trauma of what the recruitment and the fighting did to them. And this is obviously a huge and very important part of the process, and that continues along the way. And there is the reintegration back into society, whether reunification of the child with their families or finding other safe places for the children for the child to be reintegrated in a society, and then eventually, obviously, getting back the education. Most children miss out on their education, so how do you rehab that part as well? And then there are many success stories and there are many good stories, and the bottom line is that we shouldn't give up on these children. We are talking right now about tens of thousands of children who are in places like Iraq, in places like Syria, who come from areas formerly under armed groups. They should go back home and be reintegrated in their societies. The Syrians and the Iraqis among them should also be reintegrated. The bottom line is they are children, right. And this is something that we should never, ever forget.
Right, and that is a bottom line that needs the most emphasis. Thank you so much, Ms. Julia Touma, for joining us and talking to us. Mr. Fadel Abdul Ghany, as Ms. Touma said, the bottom line is that these are children. And as you talked about, the Syrian conflict is one that is extremely complex. What we hear about is civilian infrastructure being targeted more, is child casualties rising. As I mentioned before, international law exists, talking about it, the conversation exists, but implementation doesn't seem to exist. Do you feel like the world is coming to a recognition that as the casualties rise, there needs to be an understanding that these are children, that something more needs to be done to protect them?
Actually, we hope so, but like the implementation is something different. Of course, there is the international law, the international human rights and international humanitarian law, but and everyone is knowing those like rules, but no one is like at least implement those rules even after signing the convention, or there is the custom law actually. So that the thinking should move ahead. How we pressure those perpetrators to implement. This is the key issues. For example, now when the Assad regime does not even respect all the Security Council resolution without any further like movement from the international community, how he does respect the recruiting children or not disappear them or abuses against children. Even SDF, if they like the international coalition is still like funding and without any pressure in this regard or real pressure. There is some types of talks, but that's not enough. The level of pressure should be like matching the scale of violation. This is the key issues. And I agree with you totally about also the conflict. When the conflict is continued, so this is the main issue of the increase of using the children. And the children themselves also, they lost more of their parents. They lost more of their schools.
Right. Mr. Ghany, stay with us. I want to move on to Mr. Patrick Oid and talk to him about something that I was talking to Ms. Tuma about, the rehabilitation process. Now, Mr. Patrick Oid, in Sudan as well, we're talking about this country having the highest number of child soldiers. When they're brought back into society, how is the process of rehabilitation?
This is where the biggest challenge is because, for example, UNICEF says it has at least returned home more than 3,000 children. But when these children return home, especially in the southern part of southern Sudan or South Sudan, the challenge is that psychiatrists are almost not there. The only practicing psychiatrists in the country are actually only 3 in a population of 12 million. That is in the South Sudan. So you can see the challenge there. So these children, when they come, the social support to really support them to, rehabilitate to the society is almost non-existent. There are some non-governmental organizations that are trying to provide this kind of support, but also they are overwhelmed because you have a situation where, as you mentioned earlier, 19,000 child soldiers are there. There are some who are returning home. But remember, these are only the counted ones. There are those that are even not yet counted. So the number is big, and the medical personnel supposed to help them to rehabilitate back to the society are almost non-existent. It is a very difficult situation, and that's why some of them who even are brought back to the society, they find it difficult to live because they have not gotten the treatment they are supposed to get. And sometimes they go back to the armed forces because they feel the armed forces are actually their home. They are more used to the members there. They have more freedom there. They can go and loot.
Right,
they can go
Patrick
and do. They have a lot of.
Sorry to interrupt, but you mentioned something very important, and this is where I want to end the show. You mentioned how, because of the systematic failure of not being able to reintegrate them back into society, they go back to being child soldiers. Now, tell us, what do you think needs to be done by the international community at large that talks about this as being a grave issue, a grave violation of human rights?
Yes, first of all, there needs to be, of course, the legal system have to be strengthened. The legal systems have to work. But the unfortunate thing in this is that, when you are in a situation of war, the rule of law collapses, accountability collapses, and, there's no constitutionalism. So it becomes a little bit difficult. But the best thing is to strengthen the rule of law, to strengthen constitutionalism, and to make sure that the justice system works so that those who are recruiting child soldiers, if proved that they have been doing so knowingly, then they should be held accountable. That is the only way to, to try to arrest the situation. Otherwise, if you have a situation where the legal system is not properly working, then people will continue recruiting, and the only thing they can get is a peace agreement that brings them back to the government, and they are actually rewarded with big government positions. So they don't see a problem in that because nobody is holding them accountable. So yes, the legal system has to be strengthened. It has to work, and those who are responsible for this violation to be held accountable. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Pawit, for joining us from South Sudan. Thank you so much, Mr. Fadel Abdul Ghany, for joining us from Istanbul. We've run out of time for this show, but we will see you next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.